Hey and welcome to Neverwinter with Paragon. So in this video I'd like to quickly go over my Rogue AoE DPS build, and this is indeed using the Whisperknife Paragon path. So first up we'll just go over our power setup. Now you can simply go and copy and paste what I'm using right here. Primarily as our Atwell we're using Shrook and Toss whenever we don't have some encounter power to be using, and otherwise if there's a high HP enemy it's Disheartening Strike to go and put that dot on them, because you'll know they'll survive a bit longer and you'll also increase the damage you deal to them by 5%. Then for our counter powers, we're using a Blade Fury from Stealth. Sometimes this can proc off that you can cast it a second time from Stealth, so just keep an eye out on that, and that's to do with our Feats down here, which give us Stealth regen. Somewhere or another it can bug. And then we're using Blitz to basically just have a wide cone and you can hit everybody in front of you then up to a range of 50 feet. And finally we have Path of Blades, which just causes a large area around you. You can see that there once you've cast it, and anybody within it will take that damage over time, and it can rack up to a significant amount as long as the enemies can survive that bit longer. But otherwise we have like Smoke Bomb, which you can use instead for a bit of a survivability boost, and you'll switch it out instead of like Blitz primarily for its daze effect. Keep an eye out though, its cooldown is like 20 seconds compared to Blitz only at 12 seconds. Not such a big deal if you're only going to be able to cast one set of encounter powers before you move on to the next group of enemies. And for our daily powers, we're usually just using Killing Storm. You'll notice the magnitude on it is pretty abysmal, 165, but the big factor here is with the class feature Razor Action. Every hit from Killing Storm will have added to it another 200 magnitude in a burst. That'll be like area of effect damage because you're flinging daggers up to 30 feet, and for every hit on Killing Storm that procs it. So for now we're running that. That's massive. Otherwise you would use your Whirlwind of Blades if that ever gets fixed to this combo. I don't know if it's intended or not. And also if you're running as the assassin in terms of an AoE build, then Whirlwind of Blades is your go-to. Mechanics, again, usually you're just having your shift to immunity frame to make sure you don't die, and your stealth to go and basically use an extra cast of Blade Fury, and that's about it. Keep an eye out though that whenever you go into stealth, anything you hit, you'll deal extra combat advantage damage to them. So that'll be based off your combat advantage stat. You can see up to 90% more damage. That's pretty massive buff, and you absolutely want to be taking that advantage of it to the fullest, and that's why we run with Advantageous Position as our second class feature. For 5 seconds when we leave stealth, we maintain combat advantage against all enemies, allowing us to cast off all of our other encounter powers, our daily powers, our mount power, while having full combat advantage against all our targets, and also reducing the damage we take from area of effect. So that's a pretty massive boost there in terms of a class feature. Feat setup, we're using our Last Moments. If you're in fights where you might be, let's say, killing enemies and it would take longer that you could use another set of encounter powers, then shadowy preparations can be useful, because you'll notice that your Blade Fury has the lowest cooldown, so you'll generally regen your stealth back to cast this again twice, once from stealth and once for it to go cooldown, and thus using that stealth to reduce your cooldown of Blitz and Path of the Blades can be pretty helpful there. But I generally just go with the damage boost, and then that's doubled while you're stealth, which means that the hit from stealth with Blade Fury is again buffed up even further, and that's usually the first hit you're doing in a fight anyway, especially if you're questing, you're just killing off the mobs. Then Dark Reimbursement for that extra stealth whenever you leave stealth, and one with the shadows just to give you that massive boost to your stealth regen every 20 seconds, and then Shadowy Opportunity for giving you the damage boost. You might look at Shadowy Demise as something good, but unfortunately it can only proc on one target and you can't exactly choose which target target. If you could, it would be the target with the most hit points. And then we have Ambusher's Haste, which just deals up to 20% more damage depending on how full your stealth meter is. Usually it goes from full to empty as soon as you cast your Blade Fury, so then I'm assuming that this 20% is getting added whenever you leave stealth to use an encounter power. Otherwise, there's Gutted Horns Touched, and the only ranged power we're really using is Blitzed along with our At-Will, so a 5% damage boost to those is not much at all. Keep in mind though, as a rogue, we have our 5% stamina regen. We also have a 10% damage boost when we leave stealth for 5 seconds. That correlates then with advantageous position of giving us combat advantage against everything as well, along with then the 10% damage boost. And we also have Scoundrel's Training for an extra 2% combat advantage. So overall, if you're just questing in a zone, then it's very simple. You go stealth, you go Blade Fury, and yeah, everything's pretty much dead. In this new zone, enemies are pretty squishy, and otherwise you might not have, let's say, Blade Fury back or your stealth back, and then you just go to the next group of enemies and just use your encounter powers. It's pretty straightforward. And then let's say you want to use your daily, yeah, there you go, you're killing storms and everything's dead. It just can take a little bit of time to proc there. Just keep in mind of that. Also, while you're using your daily, you can actually do stuff and you'll also be invisible, and reducing the enemy's awareness is also pretty neat if you don't have your combat advantage capped. And yeah, just play around. Generally it's stealth with your Blade Fury, but you might have stealth up and Blade Fury on cooldown, then feel free to use like Blitz or even Path of the Blades, depending what area you're in. But if you're trying to like get top DPS in some dungeon, let's say Vault of Stars, then again the combo is usually stealth, Blade Fury, then like see Blade Fury again from stealth, and then Blade Fury again out of stealth, and then just using all your other encounter powers as quickly as possible and in the right positions to just annihilate everything. And if you have your daily up, of course, you'll cast that with stealth, and you'll also cast your mount power with stealth. Neither one will break your stealth once using it. So let's move on to our statistics. What do we want to be capping as a DPS? Well, all these offensive stats, along with getting as much base damage as possible. Power, we ideally want that capped all the time, so we do. Accuracy, we want just as high as possible, but the priority is power first. Then we go with our crit strike, crit severity, and combat advantage. That's usually how you would go, and accuracy last. But as a rogue, we have powers where we can take advantage of combat advantage a lot, so I would recommend focusing that second after power, and then your crit strike, crit severity, and lastly your accuracy. And we got a pretty good spread of our stats there when we're all fully buffed up, and we go and like kill a group of enemies and we can get all of our stacks buffed up. We have our crit severity capped. We have crit strike at about 85%. It's not such a big deal, and if you're in a party, you can run with like a paladin which has a crit aura to get that up to 87%. In AoE, it doesn't particularly matter, such a big deal with terms of your crit strike. You could switch out your arms for the sisters clutches from Barovia. They could give you reliably a 5% boost to your critical strike whenever you get hit with an AoE. Usually if you're doing some tough content, they'll deal more than 10% of your max HP whenever they hit you, and that way you'll be able to cap the critical strike, and accuracy stays the same there. So now we'll move on to the gear I'm using, and you can see it just simply all there. Ideally, you're wanting all the gear that's going to give you bonuses to your damage, bonuses to your offensive stats, and that's about it. Item level is kind of what you look at last. Like, we're running with the Enclave Scout's hat from the Seals of the Wild, the Ribcage from Tier 3 Avernus Haunt, the Spike Defender Van Braces from within Valenhouse, and also Juma bags. You might also want to use your Wrist Guards of Participation instead, especially if you don't have your power capped, and also if you're not using the older Watermelon Sorbet. The Lionheart weapons here, you can also run with the Masterwork weapons if you have a party which also uses them. Mirage aren't too great within AoE because you're generally just killing stuff so quickly, your clones won't do much. And finally, in our boots, we're running with the Forest Guardian ones from the Vault of Stars, from those reagents you get from the bosses. With our neck and waist, with our artifact set, we're running with the Mythalar set. That just purely comes from the new campaign here, the final reward. And then we're running with our Band of Air, of course, along with the Red Eyes Glare, both from Vault of Stars, and the shirt here from this new zone, the mini bosses to give us the combat advantage, and the trousers which come from Professions. You can also get them on the auction house, and they just give offensive stats as trousers, so that's pretty neat there. Then we go to the modifications, and you may have seen them already. We're just running power on the helm, power on the armor, a claw Bahamut on the arms, because unfortunately I can't actually switch it out. It's annoyingly, it's like protected and there's a bug. Otherwise I believe I would run like crit severity there, or even critical strike. And then in the boots we're running more power. For our main hand we're running, of course, just Shrook and Toss, because that's the at-will we were using. And in our offhand we're running with recharge speed, and then we're also just running with critical strike there. Then for our neck, waist and rings, you can see it's just all combat advantage there with the 880 kits. Then for our enchantments, you can see we have the same setup as single target, however we switch to Cursed Burn. In my opinion, there's very little difference between just running Cursed Burn and Poison Thorn. Cursed Burn will give you a tiny bit more damage, like really next to nothing that you'll notice. Poison Thorn still works within AoE, especially when you're fighting more tanky enemies that are gonna survive for like 5 seconds and you can get a few damage hits off. And otherwise I'm running as my bonus enchantment, usually movement speed, especially when I'm just questing or in a dungeon which is gonna require me to move a lot. If not, I can switch it out to recharge speed like my single target build. Like, don't be afraid to just run with recharge speed, and that way you can have the same enchantment set up on both single target and AoE, and you can also run your Poison Thorn there as well. You're always better focusing on single target damage than AoE damage pretty much for all content, mainly because it's more important to get that damage output on boss fights than it is on just killing enemies. Artifacts you can see down there. Generally in AoE we're running with our Envenomed Storyteller journals for the action point gain, and also the damage buff, and otherwise it can actually deal some damage itself. You cast it and it has this little dragon which will go and hunt down some enemies if they're nearby enough and deals damage to them. Otherwise, ideally we have 3 Storyteller journals. That increases all our attributes by 1, gives us stacks of power percentage and hit points, and also it gives us that additional hit for weapon damage whenever we critically hit, which is pretty neat in AoE. If you don't have those, of course, just go for the ones that have the highest item level with some decent offensive stats and you'll be fine there. Then we go to what race you should be using. Well, we have so many different choices, and ideally you just want to go with something that has offensive stats, and then secondary, just something that gives like a decent bonus to damage, and also your ability scores. Have a look at those. And you can see on chart here, this is kind of my representation of what I think is the best to be using as DPS to the worst to be using as a DPS. And as for ability scores, you can see I'm just running with dexterity and charisma. That's also because dexterity gives movement speed, and you don't want to be lagging behind in the party, or you'll just be dealing no damage when everybody runs ahead of you and just kills all the enemies. That's AoE for you. And otherwise it gives a boost to crit severity, which we need that stat, which is pretty good. Instead of dexterity, I would recommend switching to strength just for that physical damage boost. You'll gain about 1.5% by switching to it, and also then charisma gives the forte and the recharge speed, allowing us to cast those powers a bit faster, and also just giving us more combat advantage and power through our forte stat. As you can see there, it gives that spread. So now we move on to companions, and this is the setup I'm using. Yes, ideally you want to use an active companion, not an augment within AoE. Some people will argue against that, and it can also depend on what active companions you have available to you. Again, focus on your single target build, and secondary, focus on your AoE build. So if all you have is like an owlbear cob as your augment companion, because you're running that on single target, then by all means run it in AoE. However, I feel just running an active companion helps out a lot more. Like, look at her. She's just gonna go and kills everything. I barely had to do anything there other than tell her, hit those guys. AoE companions can deal massive damage if you're running like the Succumbus, you're running the Myskagog, you're running with any of those companions that deal massive damage on the first hit. Regis is another one. And so, yes, I am running with an active companion, and the companion enhancement gives it 150% damage boost. We're just running with companion gear here, 2 with crit strike and 1 with combat advantage. We ideally can get much higher item level versions here from, let's say, new Sharandar, and you can also get some from the new trial as well. And then we're using as our companion enhancement here as precision to give us that critical strike, the red slad for accuracy and crit severity, the Neverwinter Knight for the boost to outgoing damage against everything, Drizzt and Wolfguard just for that extra stats there, all offensive, and the Golden Cat in our utility for the combat advantage. Now again, with companions as a DPS, you just want all your offensive stats, so if you can mix and match with what you have, that's all good. Don't go out of your way to spend millions on some companion that, let's say, I have and you might not have, and you might think, I really need to have that because he has it. No, you don't. There are plenty of other companions that give you a spread of offensive stats that you can use instead of the ones I'm using. Normally the ones I'm using, because this build is public, lots of people will want to copy it. The prices on these will get really high because everybody wants what I have. There is a lot of flexibility with regards to which companions you use. Recommend testing these things for yourself on the preview server, and with that you can mix and match and see what suits you and what you have available to you and what's cheapest for your budget. So now we move on to our mounts, and this is setup we have here. We're losing a bit of combat advantage because we're not having an augment, so we switch to opportunistic here, giving us that combat advantage. I generally run with Magnificent Inspiration, and that is just from the Pegasus mount. You can of course use like the Arcane Whirlwind, that's also really good. And then there's like the Divine Intervention with the wings. People really hate the pushback on it though. And there's even, you can use Explosive Equalizer for that blast damage all around you. Anything that has good AoE and a nice high magnitude. In our stable here, we just have all of our insignias there. You can see we're just using Brutality and Dominance. I'll just switch through each of these and you can see exactly which ones we're using there in which slots. And then for the insignia bonuses themselves, you can see we're using 2 Assassin's Covenant. We're using 2 Gladiator's Guile. Now, if you look at my single target build, all we have done is swapped out these eyes for more of these regals, which give us Combatant's Maneuver, which we use in single target. Meaning you will need 17 insignias then if you want to be using exactly what I'm using. I like having this extra Gladiator's Guile for the movement speed in AoE. Just gives us that bit more movement speed to be able to keep up with the party, and also make sure, let's say, you can get to the enemies first rather than your party members. Our Combatant's Maneuver generally isn't as reliable in AoE because you can't exactly control the enemies all the time. So we run with our 2 Gladiator's Guile, and lastly an Artificer's Persuasion for giving us that cooldown reduction when we cast a artifact. As for the colors themselves, you can see it's just a practical one there, doesn't matter. Unified one, movement speed, wayfaring, crit severity, sturdy for encounter power damage, absolutely want that in AoE, and then supportive for stamina regen. Now we move on to boons, and you just want all of the offensive boons here. You also want to pick up the movement speed. You generally just want to pick up all of these depth damage plus damage resistance against certain enemy types. If you run like a whole variety of different content in terms of random queues, then you'll generally run into those different enemies. Also, if you're doing like campaigns and things, and otherwise pick up like defense and awareness, and then go like hit points or these other defensive stats as well. Tier 5, we're running with Forte, and we're also running with recharge speed, and Master Boon, we're running with Bloodlust. Guild Boon, we're just running with our critical strike there, and then defense doesn't particularly matter. and utility, whichever is most useful to you, whether it's movement speed in a dungeon or mount speed in a quest zone. And lastly, we go to buffs. Now in AoE, I generally don't use many buffs, but if you do, you want like Watermelon Sorbet, Flask of Potency, Sunlord's Gift Elixir, and just like some guild food. I use one that gives me crit strike. It's very minimal buff there. This I actually got within Chult instead of the guild food, just because it's cheaper and you don't have to grind out that guild marks. And of course, we're also using in our belt item the Forger's Box, ideally again on Mythic. We're using the Wondrous Doohickey because it does have an AoE capability along with a paralyzing ability, and then we're just using the Stone of Health to give us that health back whenever we might need it. So overall, that's my AoE build. Hopefully this is somewhat helpful to you guys. Yes, again, this is the Whisperknife Paragon that does very well. You can simply copy and paste this build except for the powers for AoE if you want to run in the Assassin Paragon instead. And the power setup would look something like this for an Assassin. You could simply go and copy and paste that, and you can see, do you prefer that over the Whisperknife? I find the Whisperknife can deal a bit more damage, mainly due to it having its advantageous position along with the daily power killing storms with the razor action for massive output and damage. You can also switch your boots out to your primal boots to give you that extra points whenever you kill enemies. I find it's not too useful, and I prefer to just run with that extra boost to our combat advantage. So lastly, I'd like to give a massive thank you to all of my channel members for helping me keep my channel going. And if I presented this well, consider leaving the video a like. And if you're new around here, consider subscribing. We'll see you guys around. Goodbye for now.